My guest today is Ines Beatrix. Ines is a professional certified career and leadership coach. She coaches people who want to make a positive impact on the world and want to play a bigger game in their careers. With over 8 years of experience in design thinking, communication, mindfulness, and coaching, she encourages people to dream big and cultivate a sense of inner calm and deep confidence. Before becoming a coach, she worked as the design thinking lead at a US bank, led projects as an innovation consultant for Fortune 500 companies, and taught design thinking courses in Paris. Ines is the first coach I receive in the podcast. She works with product managers, but also with companies who want to introduce design thinking into their organization. We talked about creative problem solving and human-centered approach, topics that are close to the heart of product people. If you want to understand the link between design thinking and farmers in China using washing machines to wash potatoes, as well as hear examples of applying design thinking in the corporate world, but also to your mental health, listen out to this episode and get tips about how to convince your leadership team to change the way your company identifies problems and goes about solving them. Thank you very much, Ines, for joining me today. I'm very excited because in this podcast, we talk about people who are behind the products, not only the product managers, but also the people who make product happen. And I often use the method of design thinking, and I thought, and actually that's one of your friends, and she's left a message, which we will listen to later, has thought, we should talk to Ines because she's one of the thought leaders and influencers in the French design thinking ecosystem. So before we start, can you clarify for everybody what you mean by design thinking?
Yes. So design thinking is a human-centered approach to innovation. So it's a creative problem-solving process that enables us to imagine and create products, services, and experiences that users truly desire. So we do lots of user research. Design thinking, because of its focus on users, is profoundly empathetic as a process because we create products and services that are adapted to our users' constraints, to their fears, their values, and motivations. So we adapt ourselves to our users. We don't expect our users to adapt themselves to our product or to our services. So another way of saying this is we don't create products and expect users to read a manual or get upset because users are not using our products or services correctly. That's really not looking at it from the user's point of view. The idea here is to adapt our products and services so that people can easily, painlessly, and happily actually use them. So the goal of design thinking innovations is to create products and services that are not only meaningful and useful to our users, but seamlessly integrate into their lives. Maybe something else that I'd like to say here is that design thinking is not just a process, it's also a mindset that requires us to be empathetic, curious, and to adopt a test and learn attitude to make things tangible and visual whenever possible, to be comfortable sharing our ideas, whether they're good or bad, to be optimistic, to always consider a plurality of solutions to any given problem. So you don't want to come into design thinking with the solution in mind, or at least you have to be very open to other solutions. Yeah.
The first explanation you gave really resonates with me because I've seen countless times people being frustrated, like product managers thinking they're not using the product the way they should use it. Well, guess what? This is how they're using it. And maybe it's our job, and actually it is our job as product managers to rethink the way we've created this product. And is it really serving the customer, and do they know how to use it rather than being just frustrated? So can you give me some examples of when and how product managers can use design thinking then?
Yes, absolutely. And maybe just before I get to that, one thing that makes design thinking so powerful for product managers who tend to kind of represent the business aspect of things is that design thinking is not only concerned with what users desire, but it's also very much concerned with that the proposed solutions are feasible so that the company can actually build them So, for example, that the company can actually create the product or a process from a technological standpoint, and crucially, that it makes sense from a business point of view so that it's aligned with the company's strategy. So I've often made a good case for design thinking to product managers who are working on innovation projects that involve different departments and who feel like they're literally swimming blindfolded in a sea of ambiguity. So these are typically projects where there's a lot of confusion and who could really stand to benefit from a very structured, visual, transparent, collaborative process. And design thinking is really excellent for that. And of course, design thinking is great for creating a new service, a product, and experience. It really works in any situation where you don't know the exact solution. So where you would benefit from user research and where you would benefit from exploring different possibilities. If you already know the outcome, design thinking might not be that useful. Yeah, so in terms of timing, you would want to start with design thinking at the beginning of your project. So what you really want to avoid is tacking on design thinking at the end of your process when your team has already started building or has committed to building something. And here, design thinking really doesn't have much of a role. So I've been involved in projects like that, and that's problematic because there's so much pressure to deliver and just create the new offering that there isn't much room for creativity and innovation. And basically the team is going to have a really big bias, an almost insurmountable one, to just keep building what they have in mind.
Okay, so that's very interesting. So let's say that design thinking is most appropriate when you've got a blank sheet or problem to solve and you don't know the solutions. And product managers can use that tool, but who else do you involve in that process?
So all the relevant stakeholders. One role which is quite important to include is the decider. So the person who's got the authority to say yes or no, because we want to make sure that the decider is informed of, all the work and is present at all the critical design thinking workshops where the big decisions are made and where the key deliverables are presented. So having that role very clearly established from the beginning and making sure to invite that decider and having them involved in the design thinking process is really important. Having someone who represents the user throughout the design thinking process is also really useful. So this could be a UX researcher, for instance, or it could be the next best option that you have. So just someone who has intimate knowledge of the user. It could actually be a user also. That's another option. And what's also good is to have someone who represents the tech aspect of things. So who'll be able to speak to whether the solutions that we're starting to think about are actually feasible from a technological standpoint. So you want to make sure basically that you've got kind of three people who can represent. One would be the desirability, so the user. You want to make sure that you have someone who represents the tech aspect, so the feasibility aspect of the process, and then someone who's going to be able to speak to the viability of the solutions, for instance, that are imagined. So making sure that it makes sense from that business standpoint.
Yeah, and from my experience, that is what I've done. So I had myself as product manager and usually final decision maker, my UX designer, my tech leads, and I've even done some workshops with users. And what I found is we were talking in a previous episode about the value of having a community and people really engaged in your product because they are quite keen on understanding better how the products are made and what drives our decisions. So involving a user in the workshop, it makes them witness how we do things and how we think about product, what are the constraints, and it builds also their empathy towards us. At some point, it's good to do the other way around as well and understand better the process.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
About learning new things. So you've actually worked in communication before, and then you started your design thinking journey. So what attracted you to design thinking?
So I got into design thinking because I was so excited about innovation and the storytelling around it. So there's something about a good story that I just can't resist. And the field of innovation is full of these human-centric stories. So I was really drawn to examples that were low tech and just relied on human ingenuity. So to me, that's what innovation was really about, with the same context, not too much technology, some brain juice, being able to create something new. So to me, I was reading about all these exciting innovations. So examples of stories that I've loved are, like, for instance, example of the clowns in the northern city of Olinda in northern Brazil, who were hired by the city to increase road safety. So I love these stories because, instead of having the usual punishing solutions with, cops giving you fines, having these alternative solutions where you use humor and you use that to encourage, in this particular case, to encourage people to wear their safety belts, not drink and drive, really speak to me.
I like the fact that you gave a Nontech example, because it's important to remind to people who are listening to us that design thinking is not just a method that you can use for tech businesses. It can be used in pretty much any industry, right?
Yeah. So I can give you some other examples. Like another example I really liked that I got from Navi Raju's book on frugal innovation, which I really recommend everyone read, is from this company called Haier, H-A-I-E-R. So it's a well-known company that makes washing machines and refrigerators. And this company, Haier, found out that a farmer in China was using their washing machines to wash potatoes instead of clothes. So rather than be shocked, they told themselves, this is probably not the only farmer that's using the washing machine to wash potatoes. So there must be many more people who are trying to do the same thing. So they came up with a new washing machine that is more robust with bigger water pipes that can also wash potatoes. And that became a bestseller in China. And I love this example because to me, it's really what having an open mind is about. It kind of has that the problem is a solution type of thinking that I really like in design thinking. And it's not a high-tech solution. It's an empathetic solution.
Great. So that's one very good example. I loved it, from a book. Can you tell me more about a project where the design thinking approach was really effective and completely changed the concept that you were working on in practice in real life?
Yeah, I'm going to give you two examples. So one more of a corporate example and one that's more in my current job as a coach. So I was working on a project. This is the corporate example, where the executives of this company were convinced that the reason why its customers were calling the call center so frequently was because customers couldn't find the questions they were looking for on the website. So we started the design thinking process by asking ourselves, how can we increase awareness of our website for our clients so that clients no longer feel that they need to call this call center? So here the assumption is that if you raise the awareness around the existence of the website, customers are going to stop calling the call center. And the design thinking process thankfully revealed that was not the problem. So during one of the design thinking sessions I organized, I had the executives listen to customer calls to the call center, and they were so surprised because it became apparent from the calls. The problem was not that customers weren't aware of the website. The problem was that customers were confused by the information they were getting on the website, and they were calling the call center to get clarifications and reassurance. So now we have a very, different customer problem to solve. It's no longer about website awareness. It's now about clarification. So now it's about how can we clarify the information our clients are viewing on our website so that clients don't need to call the call center. So yeah, you can kind of see how without that user research, the proposed solutions would have been really different. So, and listening to the real voices of the customers also made it impossible to unhear it. It's so much more convincing than cold data and charts, I find. This is real life. You hear these calls and you want to help.
Oh my God, this is a product manager's worst nightmare, I think, to try and solve the wrong problem and realize that you've done all that work to make things better, but nobody uses it because it was not their problem initially. So this is a very good example. You said you had another one?
Yeah, so I have a different example, so taken from my current experience as a professional coach. So I was doing some extensive research on burnout And I found out that there was a consensus in the literature that people who have a strong sense of meaning and purpose are more resilient to stress and burnout. So I thought, great, how can I reconnect people who are overwhelmed or who are burning out with a sense of meaning and purpose? That's what my focus is going to be on. So my hypothesis here was if I reconnect my clients to a sense of meaning and purpose, they'll be more resilient and they'll be less overwhelmed and burnt out. And I found out not quite. What I found out was that if my clients hadn't already defined a clear purpose for themselves before the overwhelm took hold, working on connecting them to their greater purpose when they were going through overwhelm or burnout was actually only going to add pressure and anxiety to what they were already feeling. So at that point, it's not giving them, meaning and building up their resilience. So now when I'm working with clients that are overwhelmed and burning out, I ask, how can we reconnect you with what rejuvenates you? What do you need to feel better? What can you control in this situation? What's outside of your control? So we explore strengths, values. We work on cultivating feelings of dignity, belonging, safety, and commitments to self, not to purpose, because purpose tends to often be about external impact. So it's very different from what I started out with, and also really goes to show how research is very important, but there's nothing like actual practice and feedback from real people, when you're trying to serve to create a better experience and outcome for people.
I like the variety of examples from, farmers and industry to tech, and now even on the personal side. So if I go back to me as a product manager, if my company decides to bring somebody like you to help us in our design thinking journey to be better and to make sure that what we design actually solves the right problems, what do you need from me in order to do a design thinking workshop and to be effective?
So actually, I think this kind of ties back a little bit to what we were talking about earlier. So knowing who should participate in the workshops is really important. So having the PM share with me who the stakeholders are, making sure we've identified the decider. It's also really important for effective design thinking workshops for the PM to share what's been done before and their expectations for the design thinking process. And then there are a few questions I always ask project managers when I'm starting a design thinking project with them. So namely, who are the target users? Who are the existing users? What are the current pain points? What does the customer journey look like? What are the existing social trends in the space? Why are you interested in a design thinking approach? And why now? How is success going to be measured? So ideally, you want to include KPIs, that include user satisfaction. Yeah, so things like net promoter scores, time spent on the app. It's going to depend on the product.
Okay, right. So you do need some material before you start the workshop. So some information about the journey of the user, but also the journey of the company, and also some metrics. So there's a bit of preparation work before for you to get some context and also to tailor your approach.
Yeah, and also to really make sure that you're not duplicating efforts. So if you haven't done anything, that's also totally fine. But that's just, in my experience, rarely been the case. But you can absolutely start a design thinking project completely from scratch. Yeah.
Right. Now, in this podcast, there's always a part where somebody else asks you a question. So this time is actually a friend of yours, Anne-Sophie, and she's got this question for you. So let's listen.
Hello, Ines. It's Anne-Sophie. So I'm not going to pretend that we don't know each other because we go way back. We know each other for almost 10 years now. I'm really glad that Magali is interviewing you on the topic of design thinking. I think it's a fascinating topic. For everyone listening, my name is Anne-Sophie Legrain. I'm a head of products at Page Group, a recruitment company. And essentially, for the past 8 years, I've been working on building innovation products. And in my current company, we don't use design thinking. And it's something I'd love to implement. And I was actually wondering, Ines, if you could give us some tips on how we could start implementing design thinking approach For me, it would be in my ideation phase, and how I can convince my senior stakeholders to invest in this approach. And I was thinking that maybe you could share with us some of the key arguments or the activities you use to create a culture of innovation with design thinking at the core at KeyBank. I really can't wait to listen to your feedback.
Yeah, these are some really, really great questions, and Sophie, thank you. So the first step, I would say, is actually finding out who you want to convince. So who your allies are, if you have any, who influences these senior executives. So a great tool for that is stakeholder mapping. So mapping out how influential the different stakeholders are with how convinced they are of the value of design thinking. So doing this exercise will help you figure out a lot of things. Maybe you need to do more research because you don't know who's influential or you don't know who needs to be convinced. It's a great tool that'll help you start thinking strategically and identify those target stakeholders that you want to convince. And maybe the first step isn't going directly to those senior executives, or maybe it is. So in terms of activities, I recommend doing a whole array of things, really. So offering to create design thinking workshops to different teams across the organization, creating lunch and learns around design thinking where people get to experience design thinking and have a good time, creating really excellent online training courses for employees to learn about design thinking. Maybe that's something you can do at a little bit of a later stage, maybe not one of the first things you want to do. You need a bit of buy-in, I think, before you get to that one. So we're social and emotional beings. So if you can get a critical mass of people to go through a meaningful, productive experience together, you'll get their buy-in. So if your company organizes annual events for its leaders, that's a golden opportunity to do some design thinking training. Design thinking really shines in these types of settings because it's pluridisciplinary, it's collaborative, and in a sense, the user is kind of what unites everyone in a company. The user's experience is everyone's business. So that tends to work very well. And I'd say that the conditions of success for these big design thinking events and workshops, or even a lunch and learn or training, is that you want to make sure that you deliver tangible results. So it's not just theory. So to actually have people work on real user and business issues that the company actually is faced with during the design thinking training. That's a winning combo for the company. And that's what tends to sell the senior executives on your proposition. So I have actually some other tips. I've been thinking about this quite a lot, when I was design thinking lead at KeyBank. So things like using visuals, to facilitate understanding of the process and of the design thinking jargon. So I found creating a poster with the clear steps of design thinking explained really helpful. Using as much as possible the language people are already using in the company, so not adding to the jargon, is also important. Finding a way to get senior executives to listen to the voice of the customers. So in the example I gave with the call center, actually having had those senior executives listen to the voices of the customers calling the call center was a game changer. So if you can find ways of getting senior executives to actually hear the user's voice, meet the users would be even better. There are all kinds of, a lot of UX researchers do video diaries. So they give users a camera basically, and users film themselves over the course of several days, sometimes using your product or service. And so if you can share, extracts of those types of things with senior leaders, that's really useful. And it's really conducive to very good storytelling, I would say.
Yeah. Okay. These are some great tips. I love the video diary. I've never seen this before implemented by UX researchers, but I think that's a great idea. Yeah. And the fact that you suggest also using a time when leaders of the company are together for a particular event, for example, and you've got people from different parts of the business, because I really want to emphasize that design thinking, even though my audience in this podcast is mostly product managers, it's also product people, and it's also everybody who is involved in products. So it could be that the engineering team needs to apply some design thinking to solve an engineering problem. It could be even the marketing team, the sales team, even the support team. Everybody could benefit from that design thinking methodology.
Yeah.
Great. So you've moved from France to the US in 2019. Your English, I have to say, is absolutely perfect. Have you seen any difference in the way that both countries approach design thinking? How do the different teams work together in France versus in the US, and in the way that people interact with the users?
So I'm actually curious to hear what you think about this, because I think we're in a sort of similar situation here between countries. And so I'm going to put a lot of caveats in, because it's really hard to generalize here, and I can really speak to only my experiences. But I would say that France is a Latin culture. So, it's a bit messy, a bit chaotic. People are used to kind of making do, finding solutions to things, being a bit creative and breaking the rules a bit. And I've found that to be a little less true in the US, actually, at least in the corporate sector, that rule breaking is a little bit less part actually of the corporate sector culture. And I'm sure that's vastly different in the US startup culture. So it's really hard to generalize. And design thinking relies quite a bit on social sciences. So I think social sciences are actually a bit more respected in France. So being academic, talking about the research, ideas, is something people are more open to and take more seriously or have more faith in, I find, than in the US, where I feel there's a little bit of a sense of we don't want to sound academic. There's a certain mistrust of academics in the practical world. And yeah, I mean, like for users, this is like the stereotype, right? That people are a bit warmer in the US and easier to talk to, maybe at least on first contact. So that's really useful for user research. So people are quite open to being approached if you give them a gift card in the US. And I'm not sure people are as easily approached in France, but these are generalizations, and there are lots of exceptions and caveats to be made here.
From my experience, more than so I've lived between France and the UK, and now I'm actually in the US when we record this. By the time the episode gets published, I'll be back in the UK. I think there is also something about the industry. I can tell the difference between when I worked in the air transport industry and then when I work in the travel industry, and now I'm in financial services. Depending on the industry, people are more open or less, and also depending on obviously the company culture and the people you talk to, which department you're working with. Is it the HR department? Is it the tech department? Is it finance? And depending on that, they will be more open to start this new way of thinking, this mindset of design thinking.
Mm-hmm. Okay, so you found that it works better with certain.
Yeah,
okay.
I'm not going to say a woo.
Okay, got it. Yeah, that makes sense. They're different cultures, actually.
So now, in each episode, I like to ask some fire questions where I make several propositions to you, and you pick one of them, and you can explain why you picked that one. So first one. So you are a coach right now, and you've worked in companies before. So self-employed or employed?
Self-employed. So at least for me right now, that's the best option. But I've also really loved working for companies, and it's thanks to that experience, that I've had as an employee that I'm able to best help my clients now, because I know what it's like to work for a big corporate company or a little agency and work as an entrepreneur. So it all connects.
Great. And USA or France?
I'd say France, but I know that when I'm in France, I really miss the US. I miss the space and I miss the nature, which is just out of this world. Here, there's just a sense of immensity that you just can't get in Europe. And when I'm in the US, like right now, I miss France, for its food and the cultural activities.
Great. Thank you very much for the discussion. I think you've probably inspired some people in product management who know they have to take this kind of approach. But, sometimes in product management, we are so busy with things, but we tend to forget the basics. Oh, yes, that methodology, which we are taught, and it's in the books and all of that, but we tend to forget about it and get on with our day. And then I think, probably inspired people who are not product managers to think, oh, actually, that is not just a product method. And that's what we've seen in other episodes when I interviewed people in product operations. I interviewed people in other functions where they said, well, actually, my job is a product. At the end of the day, I have to apply the type of mindset and type of thinking that a product manager would apply. So if people want to learn more about design thinking, or they have a question for you, how should they contact you?
Thank you for that, Magali. Yeah, so I would love to invite your listeners to connect with me directly on LinkedIn and answer this question for me. What's your biggest challenge in your job or career right now? And based on your answer, I'll have some resources to share.
Oh, that's a tough question. I'm trying to think what I would say to that was my biggest challenge. And you know what? Actually, I think my biggest challenge is to get people into this mindset of design thinking, not thinking solutions straight away. I know what we've got to do. We've got to do this. No, actually, are you sure you really understand the problem? Mm-hmm. Have you got evidence of that? Is everybody bought into what the problem is? And I think that's why I was so keen on this podcast, because actually implementing the design thinking itself is one of the challenges sometimes.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So thank you very much for your time. Really appreciate all the practical tips and examples you've given. Thank you so much.
Thanks so much, Magali. It was a real pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you.
Hi, I'm your host, Magali Pellissier, and I'm a product manager. Welcome to Product Perspectives, the podcast for product people that gives a voice to their stakeholders. Each week, I show you the other side of a product. I interview the people who contribute to making products a success. They are engineers, writers, marketers, support analysts, UX designers, or even salespeople. Not only will I give them the credit they deserve, but will uncover what makes a good product and a good product manager from their perspective. Stakeholders management is a key skill for product managers. So just as you are obsessed with listening to your customers, let's hear from your stakeholders. Thank you everyone for taking the time to listen to this podcast. I hope you enjoyed this episode and that it has enabled you to understand your stakeholder and inspired you to better work with them to make successful products. If so, please share the link with your friends and colleagues. And if you want to suggest some topics, some guests, if you have questions you'd like me to ask during the interviews, or if you have any feedback, you can write to me at magalipellissier@hotmail.fr.